You should stay because it'll be a good presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Madelyn Freundlich. She is a child welfare professional, more than 25 years of experience in child welfare practice and law, program development and implementation, training, policy, and research. She's written extensively on the topic. She formerly has served as General Counsel and Director of Child Welfare Services for the Child Welfare League of America, Associate Director of Planning for the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, Executive Director for the F&G Donaldson Adoption Institute, and Policy Director for Children's Rights. So we're going to learn a whole lot. So welcome, Madelyn.
Is it on the center right? You can hear me, yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming to this workshop on supporting sibling relationships. I have to say, there's nothing like doing a workshop right after lunch. So what I'd like to do is try to make this workshop as interactive as possible. We're going to be talking about best practices in supporting siblings who are in foster care, and I'd love to hear your ideas as we work our way through the variety of issues that impact siblings in care. I'm really happy to be here in Nebraska. This is actually my first time to visit Nebraska, and I live in New York City. So it is a wonderful change of pace to look out a window and just see vast expanses of openness. It's really so nice to be here. You've all given me and so many of the other presenters such a warm welcome. So the focus on siblings has really come from the work that I do at the National Resource Center on Permanency and Family Connections. And sibling practice has really been elevated as a key area where we really needed to look at best practices and try to identify what was the best of what states are doing across the country to ensure that whenever possible, siblings in foster care are placed together. And when that's not in the best interest of those siblings to be placed together, to ensure that healthy sibling connections are maintained. So how do we best do that? And the more we got into it, just the thornier it got, because there's so many different ways in which siblings come into care, how decisions are made about their placement, their visits with one another. So those are all issues that I hope that we can explore together today. The work of the National Resource Center on Permanency and Family Connections is resulting in a toolkit that will be posted on the website in the fall. It is a toolkit specifically that tracks a lot of what you're going to be hearing today as a preview. So we're testing out this information with you today to see if this is really hitting the need that states across the country might have as they think about best practices and best policy when it comes to siblings. So, why should we focus so much on sibling relationships? Why is that important? The longest relationship you'll ever have with a member of the family. That's absolutely right. What else? Great source of support. I was doing a workshop this morning with Jacob Rusher, and he was talking about how of family connections, the strongest relationships are with his siblings, much more so than with his parents. And I think that that's often the case for young people in foster care. Any other reasons why this is such a particularly important area of practice? Shared history, absolutely, absolutely. Other ideas? Well, I know you believe it's important because so many of you came to this workshop. So those are all important reasons, I think, for focusing on this area. And I've been in child welfare for more than 30 years. And I have to say, the earlier part of my practice, I'm not sure we really even thought about siblings that much. It's really been, I think, over the last maybe 10 or 12 years that we've really been thinking about the nature of those relationships. And when we talk about family connections, that those sibling relationships are an extremely important component of that. So as we know, we are beginning with placing siblings together whenever that is possible. So why is that important? why placing siblings together? Who wants to speak into the mic?
I said, well, they're already being separated from their parents, and that can be one more relationship.
Absolutely. So yet another loss that children may experience when they've already perhaps lost that connection with their families, maybe moving into a new community, new schools. And you've already talked about the importance of siblings in terms of continuity in their lives, shared history, and then those are the relationships often that are most important to children. So I really love this quote from Victor Grossa and his colleagues when he talked about the importance of sibling placements together and how much better children will do in many, many, many cases when they are placed together. And so he says, practice wisdom and limited research support the basic premise that children experience better outcomes when they are placed with their siblings. These outcomes include greater stability, fewer emotional behavioral problems, fewer placements, and actually fewer days in placement. There has been research that's shown that sibling groups move to permanency more quickly than when siblings were separated. So as Dr. Grossa points out, the research is somewhat limited, so we have to sort of just accept that. But there have been a growing number of studies that have looked at what tend to be the outcomes when siblings are placed together and what might potentially be outcomes when siblings are separated. So in the research that has been done, there have been interviews with siblings about their own feelings about being placed together. And here are some of the findings from that research. They feel safer in the new home, and why might that be? Something familiar, that's right. They're not in it alone, trying to adapt to an entirely new environment. They're less likely to experience emotional and behavioral problems, probably for some of those same reasons. Exactly. In some studies, they show that children score higher on the child behavior checklist. They're more likely to show more positive dealings with peers and actually function better at school when they're with their siblings. And as I mentioned, better permanency outcomes when siblings are placed together. So what does the research show us when siblings were separated? There have been negative consequences that have been identified in some of the studies. Increased trauma because of the additional separation that was already mentioned, possibly anger for having lost not only connections with parents and possibly other connections, but with their siblings as well, a sense of loss because now their siblings are out of their lives. And their self-esteem may be negatively impacted. And I found this really kind of interesting in the study that looked at this, is that when children are with their brothers and sisters, they can see the positives in their siblings. And then that kind of helps them stay in touch with what is good about their families and not really think of themselves as a bad kid from a bad family. And I thought it was a very interesting finding that children experience that sibling connection in that way. So how many children in foster care have siblings? Nationally, we know that about 65 to 85% of the children in care have a sibling. So as you can see for FY 2010, that's a lot of kids that were in foster care that have a sibling. But it's estimated that more than a half are separated from at least one of their siblings. So what would you say in Nebraska is the trend? Are siblings generally placed together? Not always, obviously. I mean, it's not always going to be the case. Would you say that at least half are separated? In line with national statistics? Yeah. So it really is an issue really across the United States and in most states, is really looking at what is happening with siblings under a variety of circumstances. In some cases, siblings come into foster care together. They intercare. What are some of the other circumstances? One sibling comes in, and then other siblings come in later, right? In some cases, some siblings come in, some siblings remain at home. So there are many different ways in which children can have siblings that come with them or do not come with them into foster care, and they're placed together or they aren't. So I was really hoping to have a young person be with me today to talk a little bit about their own experiences in foster care and their connections to siblings, but that wasn't possible. So I thought I'd bring to you the voices of 3 separate siblings talking about their relationship with their brothers and sisters. And I think these reflect the different ways in which children react when they come into care, being with or not being with their siblings. So here's Joseph, age 7. My sister is only 3 years old, but she has a big heart with me in it. Jaden is braver than me. She is not scared of the dark like me. When I was left alone in a big house, all I had was my sister to keep me company till someone returned. I love her, even if sometimes I want peace and quiet. I would be lost without her. So this really just, it's heartbreaking. It really just reflects the intensity of the closeness between this little boy and his sister, and how important it was for her to be with him as they went through this foster care journey. So here is Arlene, age 16. When they moved us and placed us all in different homes, I felt as if God was punishing me for something. It broke my heart. I had sleepless nights wondering, is my sister okay? Is she in bed? Have they left the light on for her? I cannot see myself without siblings. I am an only foster child in my home. It feels as if I am drowning because my sister is not with me. Oh, one more. This is Sierra, age 17. My siblings meant everything to me, but over the course of the last 2 years, our relationship has slowly deteriorated. There were 5 of us all together, but now I appear as an only child. The group home that we went to changed us forever. I see them, and it feels like I don't even know them at all. We were a close-knit family. Now I am out in the cold. I have faith that one day this will get better. So for those of you who have worked with siblings and sibling groups, do any of these comments from these young people sort of resonate or reflect maybe your own experience in working with siblings that either stayed together or were separated? Would anyone like to share something about your own work in this area? Okay. Yes.
I used to do in the foster care program, and I know when the kids were together, sometimes we would drive the foster cars just not, they felt like normal siblings. But when the kids were apart, all they wanted was each other.
Yeah.
So it's like no siblings.
Exactly.
We really missed each other. We did everything possible to keep it
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, it's just so powerful to hear the voices of young people themselves about what these relationships mean. And I think it really just helps for me, you know, just elevate in my own mind how critical of an area this is for us to focus on, because how really deep and profound these relationships are for these young people who have experienced so much loss. So, when we think about sibling groups coming into care, what type of siblings are most likely to stay together, and which types are most likely to be separated?
Well, big families are going to get broken up. If you've got more than 2 or 3 kids, I think, in my experience, those groups tend to stay together unless you've got relative foster placement available.
So smaller sibling groups are more likely to stay together. Larger sibling groups are less likely. What else?
We have a hard time with the teenagers and it's different genders. We have a really hard time placing them together because a lot of our teenage ones fall into one gender or the other.
Okay. So teenagers of different genders, because foster families are often sort of gender specific. We take girls, so we take boys. Yeah. Okay.
The age gap.
Age gap.
12-year-old and a 2-year-old.
Right. Right. So vast differences in ages. Yes. Half siblings. Okay. All right. Other factors that influence it.
Children that are like sexually abuse each other or have a trauma bond and they trigger each other's
Yeah.
behaviors.
So those kinds of issues, we'll talk more about that in a moment, absolutely. So you've really hit on a lot of the issues. So what the research basically tells us is that siblings are more likely to stay together in those smaller groups, as you said. They're closer in age. Place with kin, has that been your experience? It is more likely that you can place the entire sibling group with a grandmother or aunt than an unrelated foster family. They generally don't tend to be gender specific in who they will take. And also when they enter foster care. So when children enter foster care together, or some of the studies show within about 30 days of each other, it's easier to keep those siblings together. And not surprisingly, because the social worker is working on replacement for all of these kids who have essentially come in at the same time. So on the flip side, those that are least likely to be placed together is when they don't enter foster care at the same time. And there's a time span in between the entry. When placed in group care, has that been your experience? Keeping siblings together in group care environments can be very difficult. And then when there are assessed differences in what each sibling needs in terms of a placement or the particular service needs. And this particularly comes into play, I think, when one or more siblings is assessed as needing very high-end mental health treatment services. Right. But there are other factors as well that have nothing to do with the children or when they come into care, but perhaps our own organizational policies and practices that can impact how easy or not so easy it is to place children together. One common one that we see across the states, I don't know if that's an issue here, is setting a maximum number of children who can be placed in any one foster home. You have a sibling group of 4, foster parents have 2 children. Is that going to, be a possibility under existing policies? Of course, another huge issue is, do you have foster parents who will take sibling groups? And how large are sibling groups? So certainly the resource issue is another piece of it. And there may be other organizational policies or practices that could impact how successful we can be in keeping siblings together. So you're probably all familiar with the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act of 2008. Familiar? Oh yes, probably way too familiar. So as you know, this was really the first federal child welfare piece of legislation that talked about siblings and specifically stated what practice needed to be around siblings. So this is the exact language from the law. And just to sort of highlight the key features, this is the first time that we see that reasonable efforts requirement applied to placing siblings together in the same foster family home, same kinship, guardianship, or adopted placement. And as you see, in order to justify not placing a child in a home, the federal law says you have to find that it's contrary to the safety or well-being of one or more of the siblings. Now the law goes on to say that when siblings can't be placed together, then the requirement is frequent visitation or some other kind of ongoing contact between or among the siblings, unless once again, we as the agency can demonstrate that this would be contrary to the safety or well-being of any of the siblings. So it's a two-pronged requirement: reasonable efforts to place, and then reasonable efforts to make sure that when siblings are placed together, they do visit and they have ongoing contact with one another, unless we can clearly show that this is contrary to their safety and well-being. So after the law was passed, as is commonplace, the Administration for Children's Services under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services issued a program instruction that gave us a little bit more information on what the federal law was really saying that we have to do with respect to sibling placement. So you see it's Program Instruction 1011. And it basically tracks the law. It says pretty much the same thing, although you do see a little bit of added information. Talk about frequent visitation or ongoing interactions. You see they've added, it can be letters, it can be phone calls. They've gotten into the texting business as well, emails. So there are many, many ways in which the program guidance is saying that siblings can be supported in maintaining the contact in addition to visits, or instead of visits, if there's a particular reason for doing that. So as you see, the Children's Bureau also expected agencies to revisit their sibling policies and practices to determine if there would be ways to really boost the quality of practice around sibling placement and sibling visits. You also see they kind of added another little word around unless it is contrary to, they talk about a bona fide safety or well-being concern. So they're sort of upping the ante a little bit. So it just can't be a general assertion, well, it's just not in everybody's well-being. You really want that to be very clear, the reasons why a child is not placed with the siblings or is not visiting those siblings. So now, Nebraska law on siblings. You do have a handout. I thought it would be a hard copy, but you guys have gone electronic. It's in your little thing that you got, a little flash drive. I provided you with the Nebraska law on sibling placement and sibling visitation. And the Nebraska law really tracks the federal law around using reasonable efforts, placing siblings together, and facilitating contacts with them. So if you just want a copy of that, that is on your handout, on your little flash drive. So who are siblings? How do we define who is a sibling? So it's very interesting, as we began to work on this toolkit, to look at the different ways that siblings are defined. One is how children and youth view who is a sibling. So we might just be thinking that a sibling is what? A biological brother or sister. But do children in foster care necessarily only limit biological relationships as being their siblings? Have any of you worked with young people who, if you were to ask them who's your sibling, might go beyond that? Who else might they say is a sibling to them?
Anybody who was raised in their home?
Anyone raised in their home, absolutely. They've spent some amount of time with, exactly. Who else? Cousin. A cousin may really be counted like a sibling. You know, for some children in foster care, another foster child in the home may become like a brother or sister to them. So there are many ways in which young people will describe who is a sibling to them. And certainly biology may play a role in it, but their definition of sibling could be much, much broader. So then we look at legal and policy definitions of who is a sibling. The federal government has not defined sibling. They leave it to states. So does anybody know how sibling is defined here in Nebraska? Well, I was talking to one of your colleagues this morning about a case that she took to the Supreme Court and lost on, trying to preserve sibling connections. And she said that the definition has recently been expanded in terms of who is a sibling to include any biological sibling relationship that will be maintained even if, for example, a child is subsequently adopted. If they were biologically related, they continue to be a sibling. The states' laws really vary. Some states' laws, it's strictly full sibling relationships. The gentleman back here talked about half-sibling relationships. So you can have all sorts of different, even biological connections that go into who is a sibling. So as we think about this, it's just important, I think, to know that there are many ways to think about who's a sibling. Talk to the child, look at your law, or maybe even have policies or regulations that specifically look at who is a sibling for child welfare purposes. So I mentioned the sibling toolkit that we've been developing at the National Resource Center. And what we try to do in the toolkit, and we've done several of these in different practice areas, is try to identify what are the key components of best practice as we think about this particular area of practice. What is really important to have in place for our practice to really be at a quality level? So what we did with this toolkit is identify 10 components, which I have listed here on the slide. And as I said, I'm unveiling these for the first time here. So I'd love your feedback on this as we talk today about sibling practice. So just briefly, component number one is just identifying who the child's siblings are, which is sometimes a step that's surprisingly skipped, and certain assumptions are made about who the siblings for this child are. Next is, of course, assessment of the sibling group. The third area is making the decision regarding placing the siblings together. Of course, we've got federal law now directing how that's supposed to work. The fourth is listening to young people themselves about being placed or possibly not placed with their siblings. Reasonable and ongoing efforts to place siblings together. When siblings can't be placed together, their visits and contacts. Documentation, issues, resources to make sure that siblings can indeed be placed together. Working with the courts, and then training of all of the key stakeholders involved on the importance of preserving sibling connections. So how does that look as a list of best practice components? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's look at each one of these. So first, the identification of all siblings. So when we think about this as a practice component, what we are talking about is making efforts as soon as a child comes into foster care to identify all of the child's siblings, including determining whether that child who's entering care already has siblings in foster care or who have been adopted. So how could you do this? How could you identify all of the child's siblings? What kinds of things, strategies could you use to make sure that you know who that child's siblings are? Making genograms, that's a great idea. And working with the child and asking the child, who are your siblings? What else? Talking with family members to identify all of the siblings. Checking your own records. I mean, if the child says, I had a brother, I think he came into foster care, is finding out who that brother is and where that child is living. So that's really an important first step, is just even understanding who the sibling group is. Next is assessing the sibling groups. Now, as we look at best practice in this area, generally what we're finding is that in most instances, what is being defined as best practice is that you are talking to the siblings as a group, but you're also talking to each individual child about what their needs are, their interests, what are their desires about remaining with their siblings. Are there any concerns about that? Is the child desperate to remain with his or her brothers and sisters? So really talking with each child in an age-appropriate way to get a sense of exactly where each child is. And it is important, I think, to recognize that sibling relationships can vary tremendously. They can be extremely positive and close. They can be somewhat neutral, not particularly close. Or they can be very negative. And you were mentioning some examples earlier about where the relationship may have become one that is truly unhealthy and unsafe. So it's important to approach it not with assumptions that all sibling relationships are going to be in a certain direction. So when you're assessing sibling groups around whether to place them together or not, what kinds of information would be important? What would you want to assess in really understanding where these children are and what you should be thinking about in terms of their placement together? What would be some important factors? Okay, well, let's look. So here are some of the things that I think represent a list of considerations in trying to determine whether siblings should be placed together. So one is, of course, the nature and quality of their relationship. Is this a warm and affectionate relationship? Alternatively, is this a hostile relationship? The children, it's not just horseplay and not getting along, but it's truly not getting along. How interdependent are the children with one another? I mean, do they operate as individuals, with good relationships with their siblings, or are they sort of united as a group and sort of work together? The relative power and status in the relationship. So how might that play out in a sibling relationship? Yes?
Sometimes, the kids may lose, or mom and dads are going to dance and ask the oldest child if he wants to parent.
Right. Mhm.
That
Right. So the older children being parentified, younger children looking to the older children as if they were the parent. So really understanding the nature of those kinds of relationships. And then how much time have the siblings spent together? Some siblings have lived together all their lives, but is that always the case? No. Particularly in blended families, you may have stepbrothers and sisters who lived together for a certain period of time, and then that family divorced, and then there was another marriage, and then there was a half-sibling. So it could be really people, the children have spent all their time together, maybe have lived together at some point in their lives, or maybe never lived together. So there are all sorts of considerations as we're looking through this assessment process. So it's important to really use the assessment to get the actual information about the nature of these relationships in making the placement decision. And there often are some myths, I think, that we might not even be fully aware of, that we might sort of factor in. So let's just look at a couple of these. And you tell me, fact or fiction? The parentified child should be separated from younger siblings in order to give him or her a chance to be a child. Is that fact or fiction? Fiction. And why?
Because they're used to being in that role.
They're used to being in that role.
Away from them, that's what they do, and they suffer
Right.
loss of their sibling.
So they separate, they suffer a loss of their role in being the caregiver, and the younger children lose what might perhaps have been the parent in their life. That person has been swept away as well. Any other thoughts about that one?
You also have the ability to teach them to be in different roles. I mean,
Absolutely. Exactly. So it's where you are able to support them in achieving new roles and new types of relationships with one another, which would be more difficult to do if they weren't together. Absolutely. All right, what about the second one? Brothers and sisters should be separated to prevent sibling rivalry. Oh, please. If that were the case, would any siblings be living together? No, but sometimes you actually hear this, that people feel that that would be important. Because you gave the example earlier about not getting along, and so what do? Separate them? A lot of that is the nature of a sibling relationship. And sibling rivalry, in some ways, has positive aspects, does it not? What could be good about sibling rivalry? Yes?
You learn a variety of skills.
Yes.
Such as negotiation,
Uh-huh.
identifying who has good skill sets, setting boundaries.
Yes.
All those things that we normally do with us.
Absolutely. So there's a lot to be said for sibling rivalry, right? They're certainly not a reason to separate children. A child with special needs should be placed separately from siblings to receive more focused attention. Sometimes, want to talk about that?
Sure. Sometimes you have a child that's got autistic needs in particular that aren't being met either at home, or some foster families are unable to meet those kinds of needs. And so in that situation, it might be better to separate the child with special needs.
Okay. So highly specialized needs like autism, that sort of thing, it very well may be that that is the best decision to make for the child. As a general rule, probably not. Because what needs does a child with special needs have? The same needs as other children, right? So in addition to the special needs that might need particular interventions, when those needs can be met in a family-like environment with other siblings, that child is needing those connections with siblings just as a child without special needs might need them. Okay. So there are a couple of tools that have been developed which we highlight in the toolkit, that you may be interested in, that can be used to help facilitate the assessment of sibling groups. So the first one, the Adoption and Permanency Task Force, actually, this is a British task force. I find that sometimes the UK does some really nice things that we haven't done. So that is actually, that tool is on your flash drive. So if you're interested in just seeing that particular assessment tool, you might just want to take a look at it, see if it might be a resource that would be helpful to you. The sibling relationship inventory is something that I believe you need to purchase online, so I wasn't able to give you that one. But that is another inventory that you could possibly use in helping you with maybe just some general ideas of how you want to assess sibling groups and gather the kind of information that would be useful to you when you're thinking about where to go with this particular sibling group. So the third is decision-making regarding sibling placement together. We've really already touched on the federal guidelines about reasonable efforts in placing siblings together, and then ensuring that they have frequent contact, and in both instances, having to demonstrate that it's contrary to safety and well-being of one or more siblings in order not to do that. So in terms of decision-making, the Children's Bureau doesn't really provide a particular decision-making protocol for making that ultimate determination. They encourage child welfare agencies to develop standard protocols for caseworkers to use. They talk about a standard decision-making tool. They don't give one. So I do have on your flash drive one example of a decision-making matrix that might be useful as you think about how you might want to go about making that decision. It's, one of those sort of diagrams. You ask the question, if it's yes, you go in this direction, no in another. So that's a tool that you might find useful, that you can look at later. The other thing that the Children's Bureau really focuses on is reassessing placements when children are initially separated, so that you can continue in the assessment process to look at whether, well, maybe now these siblings could come together. So rather than making that decision initially and then leaving it at that we're continuously reassessing, revisiting that decision to see if there are any changes that could support bringing all of those siblings together. So what factors might indicate that sibling placement together would not be appropriate? What kinds of things? And you already mentioned some of them earlier. And you were talking about abusive relationships or sexual exploitation of sibling on sibling. What other factors might indicate not a good idea to place the siblings together? Significant imbalance of power between the siblings, okay? Certainly there are circumstances, as you mentioned, where a child has some very specialized needs that need to be addressed in a particular environment that can't be supported by a single foster family. Okay, well, so let's look at some others. All right, special needs of one sibling. The abusive relationship, which we have already talked about, where, as you see, kind of with a caveat that working on a safety plan is simply not sufficient and not effective. So I think that this factor is really sort of drawing our attention to not just assuming automatically, well, there has been physical abuse by an older sibling on a younger sibling, so let's separate them, but looking at whether there's a safety plan that could be put into place to put control and structures around the situation and keep the siblings together. Once again, kind of the organizational issue of foster placement just can't take all of the children. They lack the capacity, or they're a gender-only foster family, as we heard earlier. Sometimes you do have one or more siblings, possibly, who's in residential treatment. That's often a reason that all siblings can't be placed together, or possibly in a hospital or in juvenile detention, so they are placed out. And then another, and I think we talked about this as well, one child is so dependent on the other child that the healthy development of one or both children is impaired. And that, I think, is something that has to be really carefully assessed. There are also some significant behaviors that might indicate that separation is really where you need to go with your decision. Intense rivalry and jealousy, so the child is like totally preoccupied with a sibling and really can't even tolerate the attention that one child is getting. Certainly exploitation, chronic scapegoating of one child might be another factor that you would want to consider. Unhelpful alliances and birth family conflicts within the group might be another factor. And then unhelpful hierarchical positions. So one child is just always the victim, and that is the way in which the whole dynamic of the sibling group works out. And then obviously sexualized behavior with each other. So these may be some factors that you would want to take into account, and they may very well lead you to make, a very clear decision that keeping the siblings together would be contrary to the safety or well-being of one or more siblings. So the next is youth voice and sibling placement decision-making. And I think that we've really reached a point in the evolution of our child welfare practice where the voices of young people are really being recognized as important, and that we need to hear their voices, whether it's in service planning or looking at a permanency outcome. Well, the same thing applies in sibling placements, is really hearing the youth. What is the youth's preferences about being placed with their siblings or not, and at minimum, explaining to children and youth why they aren't being placed with their siblings, which is actually something that is required in your Nebraska law. So you really have done a nice job with that. So what else can you do to make sure that you hear the youth's voice when it comes to making decisions about placing siblings together or not? And you can certainly explain to them why they're not being placed together, but what else can you do right from the very outset? Absolutely. So really just talking to the young person when they come into care. If they come in with their sibling group, talk to them about what their preferences are. If siblings cannot be placed together or siblings come in at different times, continue to revisit that. Talk with young people about whether we need to move in that direction. What would it take to make it work?
Another thing we can do is, especially when we use family group conferencing, that those young people are part of defining a solution.
Absolutely.
They have some very creative and appropriate ways to stay connected, even if they are not in the same home. Educating both the foster families and the biological families, as well as the professional providers, is key.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. That kind of education about the critical importance of these relationships and maintaining them in the most healthy way possible is absolutely essential.
How do you know what family therapy between siblings should be used, or is it always kind of a stigma that if you're having those kind of issues in between siblings that family therapy should be set up for them?
I'm not a therapist. I would very much want to talk with a therapist about what is the most appropriate way to define the treatment plan, whether this is something that should be dealt with in a group setting, sibling group or family group, or whether the issues are such that individual therapy would be indicated initially. But I would really rely on the expertise of clinicians to help make that decision. Yeah. So here are just some examples from some other states of what they try to do to really engage the youth voice in sibling placement decision making. As you can see, in Iowa, they kind of go beyond just explaining why you weren't placed with your sibling and require that the caseworker continue to keep the young person apprised of, well, what are we trying to do, to facilitate getting you with your siblings? Or why aren't we making efforts So the young person really understands where things stand and what efforts, if any, are being made to keep those siblings together. In Virginia, as you see in their manual, they require that if the child is 12 or older, that child be consulted about sibling placement. And if they're under 12, you just seek their input. So I'm not quite sure what the difference is, but I think it's maybe just take from it. They think it's important to talk to the child about sibling placement issues. And then interestingly, in Connecticut, there's a new law to start to develop a sibling bill of rights and to make recommendations, possibly for legislative action, that will specifically address sibling placements together. Probably the most famous of the Sibling Bill of Rights is the Vermont one. And that is, I think, one that's often held up as a standard that many other states are now looking at in working with young people to craft. And as you see here, that Bill of Rights includes the right to be placed with your siblings, or if you cannot, be placed in close proximity to your siblings in order to facilitate that ongoing contact between siblings. And also they have the right to maintain consistent and regular contact, and that's included in their service plan. So this is really a beautiful piece of work, and I think one that's really been held up as a model if it's something that Nebraska might potentially be interested in the future. So reasonable and ongoing efforts to place siblings together. I think we've really talked about this one quite a bit. That initial placement, that continuously revisiting and reassessing whether siblings can be placed together, placing them in close proximity to one another when they can't be placed together, and also to really look carefully at issues related to disruption of placements that impact siblings. I just don't even know how many stories I've heard from young people, and I'm sure you've heard them too, that they were initially placed with their siblings, it didn't work out, and they were all moved to separate homes at that point. And so frequently the outcome of disrupted placement is sibling separation. Have you had experiences with that in your own practice? Yeah. So this is what a couple of really wonderful researchers had to say about placement and practice. Fred Wolsham has done a lot of work in this area, and this is what he and Zimmerman say. It's critical to place children together from their initial placement forward. This requires a commitment to having foster care resources available to accommodate siblings, especially large sibling groups. For children entering foster care after their siblings, it means identifying children immediately as a part of that group, going back to that first component of identifying all siblings and uniting them in their first placement. So really making every effort to find that sibling, where is that sibling placed, and place that next sibling there, unless, of course, the decision is contraindicated by the needs of any given sibling. So what do you think about that? Does that make sense in terms of an overall strategy to really preserve sibling connections? So, how can stakeholders help ensure that siblings are initially placed together? So you have a sibling that came into care, now another one is coming into care. That first one is with a foster family. What are our strategies that we use to try to get those siblings together? Yes?
I wonder if in the beginning, when they take a child and they know they have siblings.
Right.
So when they place them, maybe, see if, if this other child comes into care, what should we kind of anticipate that?
Yeah.
Would you guys be willing to take what that will happen?
Right. So really doing some anticipatory planning here, that if you're bringing one sibling into care, I know certainly when I was doing child welfare, it was apparent, that there may be a risk that siblings not coming into care right now may come into care. Really factor that into the initial placement. Checking with that foster family, just saying, replacing Johnny, there may be a chance that Johnny's sibs will come into care. Will there be space? And really looking at that ahead of time. I think that's absolutely right. Other ideas? Okay. So here are some examples. Oklahoma actually has a nice policy, examples of reasonable and ongoing efforts to place siblings together. So here are some ideas, some of which you have already mentioned. Using the family team meetings to continuously address sibling placement issues and bring it to the attention of everybody on the team. Diligently searching for relatives, as we know that relatives are more likely than non-related foster parents to take in sibling groups. And so maybe that's not a relative that was immediately identified, but through your diligent search process, you might find other relatives that would be able to take a sibling group, including a large one. Ongoing discussions with your foster care specialist or whatever they may be called in your community, this is what they're called in Oklahoma, regarding placing siblings together. So really keeping it as a priority issue. And then requesting that placement providers for siblings notify the agency when there's an opening in the placement provider's home. So sometimes we may place a child in a foster family home, and that may be the last bed available in that home, but then other children in that home are reunified or leave the home for other reasons. So always sort of being aware of where there's availability so that if a sibling comes in, that place is one that you immediately go to keep those siblings together. Now, Idaho, interestingly, has a wonderful sibling placement policy, and it is also on your flash drive if you're interested in looking at that. And here are some of the things that they sort of require based on their protocols that their caseworkers do. First, at intake, find out where every sibling is. Next, always start with the assumption that siblings should be placed together, and then have to have evidence that defeats that assumption. So that's where you start with. And then you make that decision, but you're starting with that assumption. Letting caregivers know, whether it's foster parents or adoptive parents, that the permanency plan is to keep the siblings together. So make that very clear from the very outset. Now here's one that has come up in a couple of places, and that is having one worker responsible for all the children in the sibling group. And that's a recommendation that we've seen in a couple of states, policies and practices. That can be, I think, tricky to sometimes organizationally do. But what we're seeing is that when that's possible, then that worker is going to really be focused on keeping those siblings together. And it's far more likely that those decisions will support those ongoing connections. And then, as we've already said, explore the children's placement preferences as well as kinship care providers as a really priority placement resource when that's available. So some states have developed practices and policies that require ongoing efforts to reunite siblings. We've already sort of talked about this, so let's just move on. So what steps should be taken when siblings cannot be placed together? What's our obligation then? We've done the assessment, we've made the decision, we've documented our reasons. So what do we do now? We've placed siblings separate from one another. What is it that we need to do now?
Plan around visits.
Sorry?
Create a plan around regular visits so that we keep in contact.
Exactly, create a plan around regular visits. And what would that plan include?
And everything from transportation to get there as well as an appropriate place for the visits to occur.
Yeah, exactly. So the actual schedule, location, transportation, be as specific as possible about what these contacts are going to be, how they're going to play out, who's responsible for what, for making sure that they happen.
What we have done is literally put them in the same school system,
School system, yeah.
so that, and in fact, one family, they were literally across the street from each other.
Oh, great.
So to be able to see each other regularly, and so it
Yeah,
works.
that's perfect. And that fits in with some of the policies we see in other states, is placing those siblings in close proximity to one another. How much closer across the street in the same school district. That's really great. So this is just another example from Texas on just the things that need to take place when siblings cannot be placed together. So what steps should be taken when a joint placement of siblings disrupts and one or more siblings is moved to another placement? Have you ever had this kind of situation in your practice?
Preparation of the children, both children to know they're still going to be safe, where they're going, and what the visitation plan is, and what they can expect to, how often they can expect to see visitors.
Excellent, absolutely. So that full preparation and then the follow-through. Once we tell them what that's all going to be, what is going to happen next, and really explaining to them the reasons for the move. Absolutely, those are all really important. So when we look at some of the policies in counties and states across the country, certainly one piece is try to prevent it in the first place, is to not immediately move to disrupting a placement, but looking at whether there are ways to sustain that sibling placement together. It's interesting, a young woman that I was talking with was giving her history, and she explained how she and her two brothers had been placed together in a foster home, and she and her younger brother did really well. They really adjusted, but the older youth was not doing well in the foster home. And so the agency made the decision to move all three of them out of the home because they said they wanted to keep them together. But the next step was to send each of them to a different foster home. So it's, with all good intentions, trying to keep siblings together by disrupting that whole placement ended up with everybody being separated from one another. So here are some of the things from Cuyahoga County that I think might be taken into consideration when it looks like a placement is getting ready to disrupt. First of all, are there services that you can provide to prevent the disruption to begin with? Is there work that you can do with that foster family or with that relative caregiver to keep everybody together? The example I just gave was exactly what happened, was moving all siblings if one child needs to be moved. But if you're going to do that, the goal is to keep all of those siblings together in the next placement. If children have to be separated, it's really looking at, how can you keep them together, or how can you reunite them as soon as possible? And as you can see in their policy, they are requiring regular 90-day reviews to try to keep those siblings together, as well as documenting any reasons that really are compelling and justify the separation of the siblings from one another. So it's important to know, I think, that fostering connections, the federal law, doesn't describe what frequent means when it talks about frequent contacts among siblings who cannot be placed together. Also, an important point on the law is that it applies only to siblings who are in foster care. So if a child is in foster care and siblings remain at home, these requirements do not apply to that relationship between the child in care and the child at home. So what is best practice around planning for sibling visits? How can we best do that? I'm losing you all, aren't I? Yes.
I'm sorry.
All right, why don't I just go through the slides? You want to do that? Okay. All right, so let's just look at, we're going to look at some best practices around planning for sibling visits, for the frequency and duration of visits, and canceling sibling visits. So those are all issues that often come up. So when we look at planning, you already mentioned it was really great, is developing that plan for visitation and being as specific as possible about how the siblings are going to visit. As you see, Virginia requires that as soon as kids are placed in separate homes, those SIBs are separated, within 15 days, you've got to have a plan. And you've got to begin the visits and the communication. So no time is lost as we're trying to figure out what to do. Idaho, in terms of frequency and duration of visits, requires a minimum of contacts once a month. There can be additional contacts like telephone calls or emails or texting, but monthly is the requirement there. On the other hand, in Illinois, it's twice a month that contacts are required. So you see some real differences in policy and just other provisions here. So I don't know, does anyone know what the requirement here is in Nebraska around siblings seeing one another?
There's not a requirement. The suggested rate is a minimum of 1.
Yes, okay. So the suggestion is a minimum of once a month. Okay. So as you can see, different states have taken different approaches to this. And frequency is certainly something that can be individually negotiated depending on the circumstances of the situation. But I would say once a month is probably considered minimum by virtually every state. Now what about canceling sibling visits? Is this an issue that you've confronted? Why might a sibling visit be canceled?
Child has a sporting event or something for school.
Child has something else to do. Okay, what else? Behavior of the children after the visit. Exactly. Have you had any situations, I've certainly heard of these, I don't know here, the visit canceled as a punishment or a form of discipline for the child? Yes. Sibling visit canceled because the caseworker has a conflict? Yes. So those are often reasons given to cancel the visits. So here you have some examples of states that are really trying to address that head on. So you see in Illinois, you can't cancel or reduce the frequency of the visit because somebody's not available to supervise the visit or as a form of discipline. So it's really addressing some of those common issues. Missouri can't cancel a visit because something unexpected happened in the caseworker's schedule. There always has to be a backup plan in place to make sure that that visit takes place. So those are some ways in which states have tried to address reasons for cutting back on sibling visits or just not having them occur at all. I do think that frequently I've heard this happen more often, the form of discipline explanation, when children are in group homes. That often is sort of used as the disciplinary form. So the next component, I'm just going to touch on it, is documentation. And we really saw as we looked at state policy and practice that many states do require some type of documentation that reasonable efforts were indeed made for the siblings to be placed together, and documentation of the reasons they weren't placed together that are a bona fide safety or well-being concern. Same thing about visitation, is really documenting what has happened in the visits, what went well, what did not go well, if the visits were not held, what were the reasons. I'm just going to skip through this. All right, so then component 8 is resources for sibling placements together. And we've talked about this, I think, already. First is beginning by looking at relatives as the placement resources for children. Knowing that relatives are often far more able and willing to take on sibling groups, including large sibling groups. Looking at the current caregivers of a child for one or more additional siblings to join that family. Specifically recruiting for foster families and adopted families for sibling groups. And there have been many strategies, recruitment strategies developed by Adopt-Us Kids and other organizations around that. And then, I think many of you, some of you have already mentioned the importance of training caregivers, whether they are unrelated foster families or relatives, about the importance of sibling relationships, the grief and loss that children experience when they are separated from their siblings, and the importance of maintaining those healthy connections for children. Also providing support, obviously, for sibling caregivers. Many of these are needed, of course, by all foster families, but with large sibling groups, these are certainly services that might be particularly important. Next is the courts, and the courts play such an important role in sibling placement and sibling visitation. It's often the courts that are holding us accountable for making these things happen. And I just love this quote by Judge Lynn Edwards. He was talking about this issue and saying, "Judges will find that attention to sibling contact will accomplish the law's goals and be greatly appreciated by the children appearing in court." So he is such a good egg, he really is. And then finally, training on the importance of preserving sibling connections. So generally departments, the child welfare departments will have training on siblings. Does that happen here? Is that a component of the ongoing training? Possibly. It could also be training for court personnel, for judges and attorneys around the importance. Yes. Oh, great, great. So really, I think all stakeholders can really benefit from this focus on siblings. Whether it's the courts, it's CASA, it's child welfare, educators, all kinds of stakeholders. So, any comments? Yes?
I have a question. You have a situation where you have older siblings whose the parental rights have been terminated. A new sibling is born. Any consideration to placing that new sibling with the older siblings? If so, what things to consider in trying to determine whether that's in a child's best interest?
You know, it's a really interesting, I think, scenario. I'm assuming that you're sort of, in your case example, we're assuming that the older siblings would have an interest in being a resource for that younger child.
Most people, when they find out they have a younger sibling, want to know who that sibling is.
Yes,
but the question will be if the parents are able to visit with that baby, able to have contact with the baby, the older kids, what the impact on the older kids is, that, wait a minute, how come she gets to see mom and dad and we don't, or is she going to be hurt when she's visiting mom and
And
dad?
are the older kids adopted by another family?
Yes.
I see. Yeah, that's a complex situation. Are the older kids adults?
No, they're younger, but they know their parents.
Oh, I see. So it's like placing that infant
with
the adopted family. Yeah. It's really kind of a complicated situation. Certainly something to consider, but I think that there are a lot of really complex dynamics going on in that one. Yes. Was there a hand up? Yes.
I just thought that, I try to think ahead, and in a case like that, I would be worried that as those younger children grow and they become adults, are they going to be angry that they didn't get the opportunity to know that baby, know that sibling? Is it a full sibling or half? Or full sibling, wow.
That happens a lot.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It's a really good example. It would be a great case example to use, I tell you. Definitely would be. Thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
Yes.
I'm curious how you weigh placing children with their biological fathers, given that a lot of times siblings have different fathers.
Yeah.
So your first thought might be to look at the biological fathers, which would mean automatically separating them. And since there's the situation they might not be the most cooperative with visitation.
Yeah, and I think, it's one of those many dilemmas in child welfare. How do you prioritize? So is it connecting the child with their parent? Is it keeping the siblings together? We often talk about that in terms of fostering connections. Okay, so what's more important? Placing the siblings with kin, keeping them in their same school district. It's like all of these different things that have to be weighed, and that's a very, very important one, I think. Well, I'm noticing that it's 3 o'clock, and you're also getting restless. I don't blame you. Thank you for your attention. I hope this was helpful, and enjoy your